as well. So certainly it is part and parcel of that particular thing, but more about it later. In the Islamic world, there have been interesting developments on this side as well, insofar as there we'll be talking about scholarship that the Muslims themselves have affected on the subject of their own history and their own language, especially in Arabic-speaking countries, from the very, very beginning. And as I mentioned earlier, this has been, in many respects, a great help, of course, to modern Western researchers as well. This has to do with the development very early. Again, we don't really know how early, but definitely by the end of the first Hijra century, let's say, of a number of attempts to understand the Quranic text better, as well as, of course, the life and the implications of the life of the Prophet himself. So again, following the traditional narrative, which, as far as I can tell, is not really all that far off the mark, we have interest in the Arabic language developing from the attempts to understand precisely what is that the Quran is saying, the Arabic text of the Quran. And the early philologists, the people who developed this thing, were savvy enough and sophisticated enough to know that, well, if a word occurs in the Quran, and only once or twice or 3 times, not very much, and we're not very sure what it might mean, perhaps we should look at other Arabic texts and see how that word is used. It's called comparative philology. And of course, for that, they went very rightly to pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, which at the time presumably was not yet written. People memorized it. There were poets and the reciters who had memorized poetry in any case, but there was a collection of poetry in people's minds and hearts, as they would say, which was later, of course, written down, to which they had recourse. So there was an attempt to understand the Quran, the Arabic of the Quran, in historical terms, in the sense that although the doctrine was, of course, that the Quran is an eternal text, since it is the very word of God, it was always with God, obviously. Nevertheless, the fact that it was revealed at a particular time in clear Arabic to a particular man gave it a certain historicity, which the earlier scholars relied upon to be able to understand the meaning of those words in comparison with other contemporary words as such. That is a very important, critical approach that the earliest Islamic scholars applied. In addition to that, of course, we have all sorts of other related disciplines developing around understanding the career and the text of the Quran, especially its history, the chronology of its revelation, and the Muslims were very clear, almost from the very beginning, as to which verses of the book, of the Holy Book, were revealed in Mecca before the migration of the Prophet, and which were revealed in Medina. Already made that distinction. Modern scholarship hasn't really improved on that very much, except that they said, well, even the Meccan period, we can subdivide into 3 periods. So now we speak the first Meccan period, the second and the third Meccan period. This was the great Orientalist Nördeke in the 19th century. And basically, his division, more or less, is accepted as being chronologically sound. But again, he based many of his arguments on the early Muslim scholars' statements themselves about the chronology of the Quran. When was this particular verse revealed? There was also another discipline developed, the Asbab al-Nuzul, causes of revelation. What caused this particular verse to be revealed? So we have a whole narrative developing behind it. On that particular day, such and such happened. That was the problem that was facing Muhammad, and then God revealed the following verse or verses. And we have that. So these were the kind of historical investigations into the text itself, which, as I said, showed a certain kind of historical approach to understanding the text by the earlier scholars, which continued throughout the centuries. Another aspect of the very, I should say, objective and historical approach to the study of the Quran has to do with the readings of the Quran. Again, I'm sure most of you may know, but the Arabic script in which the Quran was first written down, whenever it was written down, according, of course, to the traditional account, was during the Caliphate of Usman, the third caliph, in the 650s. The Arabic script at the time had not developed certain aspects of it that enable one to differentiate among different letters. So that this is the scriptio plena, as it's called, it's the script, which is in a sense the skeleton, almost in Arabic, the rasm resim that we say. So you have the skeleton of the word, but of course, depending on how you point that word, basically what kind of points you put above or below, that word can be read differently. So on account of these reasons, the Quran was memorized, of course, and people then would recite it according to the way that they had learned from their masters to recite it. But of course, there were different ways of reciting it, and by the 3rd, 4th Islamic century, it was realized by many scholars that there was some discrepancy in the very text of the Quran. Now, this was a very serious matter, in the sense that here we're talking about a text which is the very words of God, and we have different versions of it. Well, clearly one version has to be right and the other is wrong, but the question is, how are we, let's say, the Muslims in the 4th century, going to decide that? Because everybody who supported a particular reading of the text said, well, I learned this reading from my master, so-and-so, who learned it from his master, you go all the way back to the Prophet. And of course, if you look at all these individuals, both the latest reciters and the whole people in the chain, given the very accurate biographical dictionaries that the Muslim scholars had drawn up, all these people were extremely reliable, upright, and trustworthy Muslims. So there was no way that someone said, well, no, this guy was not good enough, he didn't remember it properly. That is, you cannot discount a particular set of readings by discounting individuals as not trustworthy. So there was no outside means of deciding what was the original text of the Quran. How do you resolve the problem? Well, two ways. Either, of course, you start fighting each other and say, no, my version is better, which, of course, will not be correct. Or, of course, the Muslims did the very reasonable thing. They said, well, all of those we will simply take to be authoritative and authentic, and Allahu A'lam, of course, God knows best, obviously, what he said. So, in this case, again, the expression God knows best is not really one of giving up on methodology and giving up your responsibility in solving this particular problem, but it's an expression of the very methodology that we are using, in the sense that there are no objective criteria by which we can decide which is the real text of the Quran. So, of course, we can all decide that all of these are authoritative, and this has continued. The text that is used nowadays, of course, is one of those 7 or 14, in case whatever it was. So we have in early Islamic history, the first 4 centuries, some very serious and very reliable attempts to try to understand both the early history and especially the text of the Quran. And this is, again, a very important aspect of Islamic studies, because it helps us in our own work as we try to understand those different subjects. Of course, there are always problems with things, and the particular problems, and here I would like to say a few more words about Quranic studies and early Islamic history, because this has been a very controversial, perhaps in the good sense, sometimes in the bad sense of the term, the last 30 years or so, since the 70s, as such. Because trying to understand what happened the first century and a half after the Hijrah, it is until the end of the Umayyads, until 750, 780s, the early Abbasid period, is difficult because almost the entire material that we have, written documents that we have, about that period was written after. So it was written, we don't have any original document. We have people that saying, I read this from so-and-so, well, that's what he read, let's say, in the 50s or 60s after the Hijra. But we don't know, we have a quotation from the original book, not the original book itself, as such. So this has raised many, many doubts in the minds of many when they are trying to study early Islamic history. So that they developed all sorts of shades of trusting these sources, so to speak. In just a new review that came of a book that was written just came out this year by Asma Saluddin, an American scholar who is herself Muslim, and she wrote a book called The First Muslims, in which she tries to say what the first Muslims, how they behaved and what they did and what was their idea of the state formation for the early Islamic state. And she wants to use this for the contemporary discussions about what form should an Islamic state take, basically, which is of course a very hot topic nowadays, discussed very, very much. And there is a review of that book by Chase Robinson, who used to be at Cambridge, now he's in New York, I think. It just came out in Past and Present, and I asked her to pass it around, in which he reviews it, well, both critically and non-critically in any case, but he brings out the many issues that are involved in writing this thing. And as Chase Robinson says, exactly because the sources that we have are written after the events which they describe. Gives an example, for example, that Abu Bakr, the first caliph, first successor after the Prophet, he gave on one occasion, he gave a particular speech. And Tabari, the great Arab historian, who wrote around 900, he died in 1995, he has this speech, he quotes this speech. So of course, the question is, how does Tabari know what Abu Bakr actually said? Who wrote it down at the time? Because at the time of the book, it was unheard of for someone to sit down and take notes about somebody's speech, so that there would be a written record of that. Well, you can say people memorized it, but again, how memorable was the speech, and why would people memorize it, and why would people remember it for 200 years, and then somebody writes so that Tabari eventually gets access to the version. So there are these kind of problems that have been asked, of course, in relation with other histories and other historical sources. Pericles' famous oration speech that we have in Thucydides, for example, is another example. Well, was somebody writing down basically every single word that Pericles said? Or is Thucydides somehow